In this module, we're going to learn about Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche's a German philosopher with a very substantial mustache, a hipster before his time. He lived from 1844 to 1900. He's sort of two ideas. He was a very good at slogans and phrases and so on. And so two of his big ideas, and we don't see these slogans in the selection for our class, but are that God is dead, by which he means not only does God not exist, and so Christianity and Judaism and Islam and any other religion that believes in something like a perfect being, those are all false. But also, we have now realized that God is dead, so God is dead to us. And then secondly, this idea of what he calls the will to power, which is the will that each living being has to survive and to impose, and to survive by imposing its will on the world. And so to be powerful, to make the world the way it wants the world to be. And he upholds that as a good thing. Nietzsche's a very aggressive writer. So in another text he writes, "One day my name will be associated with the memory of something tremendous, a crisis without equal on earth, the most profound collision of conscience, a decision that was conjured up against everything that had been believed, demanded, hallowed so far. I am no man, I am dynamite." So he's saying there's this crisis, we're losing something, something big is being threatened, and I'm the threat. I'm actually going to blow it up. I am dynamite. So he's comparing himself to saying, I'm doing something really important, and I'm doing it in a violent way. And he later says, this little essay talking about a different essay is a great declaration of war. And regarding the sounding out of idols, this time they're not just idols of the age, but eternal idols, which are here touched with a hammer, as with a tuning fork. There are no idols that are older, more assured, more puffed up, and none more hollow. So he's going to take the idols that his age has, what the things that his age puts up on a pedestal and says, these are the most important. He says they're hollow. I'm going to show you they're hollow. And how am I going to do that? I'm going to take a hammer to them and smash them. So he's going to have some very controversial ideas that we might find very controversial, even very strongly disagree with. He's going to test our idols, and we might not like that. Now, our idols maybe are going to stand up to his tests, although he thinks they fail. But we want to sort of recognize that he's going to be saying things that we might even find even potentially offensive. Even so, lots of people have found value in his work all across the sort of political and sort of intellectual spectrum, partially because he's going to test our idols, and we're going to see how they stand up, and partially because they think he has valuable things to say about how moral systems function. So the way into this is we're going to think about Christian morality. On the one hand, we know that Nietzsche, we're not going to see him argue for this, but he thinks that Christianity is a false religion, at least insofar as, the God it thinks exists doesn't exist, Jesus is not a savior, and all of that. And yet, at the beginning of the text, he praises Christianity, and that's kind of weird if he thinks it's false. Why is he doing that? And what we'll see is that in understanding his praise for Christianity, we're going to understand how he thinks about moral systems and how he thinks about the will to power. So this is the Sistine Chapel. This was painted by Michelangelo in the 1500s. Took about 8 to 10 years. The first 4 years he was on his back painting the ceiling. And then later he painted that Last Judgment on the wall there. And they were both really monumental tasks, literally very physically painful, like lying on your back every day for 4 hours painting is not pleasant. And yet it's considered a work of genius. It's one of the high points of Western art, European art. This, you likely have seen this and probably seen lots of jokes about it, memes. This is God creating or giving life to Adam. And then this is the Last Judgment, where Jesus is sending the sinners down to hell and the holy up to heaven and judging the rest of them. So Nietzsche thinks of this creation of the Sistine Chapel. Well, he's not Christian. He would think of this as a really an amazing accomplishment, a life-affirming accomplishment, something that makes life worth living. It puts the people who experience it are awed by it. They puts their life in a bigger perspective and gives value to their lives just by experiencing it. And so Nietzsche says, look, that's great. Even though I disagree with Christianity, I think the Sistine Chapel is an amazing and valuable thing. And so why does he like Christianity? He doesn't like it because it's true. He thinks it's false. He says it's even stupid. And he doesn't like Christianity because it's kind. He thinks it's harsh. The reason he likes it is because it gets people to do things like create the Sistine Chapel. And creating the Sistine Chapel was very challenging and painful. So what it did is it provided along, in his terms, obedience and bondage, right? It's 8 years of Michelangelo's life are devoted to creating this religious masterpiece. And Nietzsche thinks that Christianity is irrational and unnatural. It involves suppressing various of our natural impulses. And that's good. The tyranny, the arbitrariness, the stupidity of the religion, he likes that. He says it educates the spirit. It forces our will. It strengthens our will and drives us to create in response to these demands. And it produces the sorts of things that make our lives worth living, like the Sistine Chapel, that are in some way so we're talking about things like virtue, art, music, dancing, reason, spirituality, in all these different areas, we find our lives expanded, that we're in some way, our view of the world is expanded. We get a new view of the world, of the possibilities for living in it. And it's important that we have these constraints on us because it's very hard to expand our view of the world in this way. At least that's what Nietzsche thinks. And so we need these potentially, in his view, tyrannical or arbitrary rules to create these things, to make us create these things that make our lives worth living. It's the discipline, fundamentally, that's provided by the moral system that leads to these life-expanding creations. Now, and it's through self-assertion, right? So the religious system, say, drives us, but it drives us to create something, to impose our will upon the world, right? Michelangelo had to have a very strong will to think it was worth his while spending 8 hours creating the paintings there in the Sistine Chapel. Now, Christianity is not unique in this regard, so Nietzsche really loved Greek tragedy. This is a story of Oedipus who eventually ends up unknowingly killing his father and marrying his mother and claws his eyes out as a result. That's a Greek tragic mask that would have been worn in plays. He thinks this Greek tragedy allows us to experience what's terrible about and difficult about human life, because there are such things, in a way to put it into a perspective to actually allow us to live engaged and valuable lives. So sort of having the experience of Oedipus's tragedy helps us, right? It'd be terrible to accidentally kill your father and marry your mother. Oedipus didn't know that's who they were, and so he was first literally sort of confused about who they are, and later he's sort of figuratively blind, and he becomes literally blind when he claws his eyes out after realizing what he's done. Nietzsche also loved opera. This is a picture of Wagner there on the left, who was a very important German composer of operas, a contemporary of Nietzsche's, who Nietzsche, in his characteristic way, eventually had a falling out with. We've got a picture there of a staging of one of Wagner's operas from the Ring cycle, which has a lot of affinities with the Lord of the Rings, maybe inspired by it, or maybe they had common sources. They certainly had common sources. Tolkien may have been inspired by the Ring series. And then in the bottom right, we have a painting of the Ride of the Valkyries, which is an event from Wagner's Ring cycle and from the material that Wagner was inspired by. It's music you will very likely recognize, whether or not you're much of an opera buff. There's a link below to a video of it, which you could take a listen to, and I think you'll very likely recognize it. And indeed, Wagner's music, while very few of us go to the opera, his music has spread in many ways throughout popular culture. But you may not be into Greek tragedy, and you may not be into opera, and so you might think, oh, well, whatever, Nietzsche doesn't have anything to say to me, and I'd suggest that might not be true. So another issue, a thing that Nietzsche doesn't like, and this might be relevant, is that if we might ask this question, does following utilitarianism or Kantianism make life worth living? And Nietzsche's going to say no. And we're going to see him articulate that claim in some of the next videos, and that's what he spends a lot of time arguing about in in the text. And this is one area that we might not like. He uses the terms master morality and slave morality. We might find those terms uncomfortable. I suggest it's worth engaging with the text, even though he's speaking in these ways that we might find distressing. But what else does make life worth living in general, right? In particular, what makes your life worth living? What is it that you find valuable about your life? Because it's probably not... maybe it's cartoons, maybe it's anime, I don't know. But it's probably not Greek tragedy or opera. So what is it in your life? And does it involve you asserting yourself? Nietzsche would say that's your will to power. And what Nietzsche thinks is that what makes your life worth living are those occasions where you do assert yourself, where you bend the world to your will. And he thinks you can do this, and he thinks that's what's really valuable. And you might think, not just sort of how does that bear on my life, do I see others living in these ways? So Nietzsche thinks if you follow the utilitarian and the Kantian view, which you might have thought, well, I don't agree with those exactly, but this sort of basic stress on altruism is a good idea. He says you're going to be crushing your will to power. But if instead if you recognize the problems with those systems, then you can instead live this rich life and assert yourself and create things that make your life worth living, that in some way expand your horizons, that are new and novel. And that's what Nietzsche really wants to stress as being what's most important. So in the rest of the videos, we're going to see him develop, and in the reading, we're going to see how he tries to develop those ideas, how he's going to criticize utilitarianism and Kantianism in more detail by talking about how they work, and present an alternative moral system that he thinks is superior because it allows you basically to assert yourself, to make a life worth living by asserting yourself and creating things of value. So that's what we'll be seeing, and we're going to see him do so in this bombastic way where he's talking about dynamite and hammer, and that may be uncomfortable, but even if you end up disagreeing with him, as is likely that you will do, I think you'll still find it very stimulating and provocative and an interesting challenge to the views that we have been looking at so far. So let's get into that.